I personally am very much looking forward to hearing from Senator Sanders on his new book and its roadmap for how we get there. So please, everyone, a huge New York round of applause for the one and only Senator Bernie Sanders.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me thank all of you for coming out, and let me thank Maurice for the introduction and for the great work that he is doing. What I want to do this evening in a kind of informal way is talk a little bit about the book, and some of it will be personal, some of it will be political, some of it will be senatorial, and when I'm finished, we'll open it up to some questions that I think people have already submitted. In a sense, this book is a sequel to the first book that I wrote, which is talked about the campaign of 2016. And what this book does is pick up kind of right at the end of that. And the first chapter deals with a meeting that I held in Washington, D.C. With Hillary Clinton and her staff. And what that meeting was about, the campaign had come to an end. We had run very hard in California, which was very important to us. And we hoped that we could win, and we campaigned really hard, and we did pretty well. We ended up with, I think, 47% of the vote, but we didn't win it. And not winning California essentially meant the end of the campaign. And a week later, I met with Secretary Clinton and John Podesta and Robbie Mook, and my wife Jane was there. Thank you. She has a bigger fan club than I do. She would be here tonight, but she's putting on a great conference in Burlington for this weekend. And Jeff Weaver, my campaign manager, was there. And what we sat down and we talked about is, okay, where do we go from here? And that meant, to my mind, how could the Clinton campaign kind of galvanize working people and young people in this country? And that meant to me working on a progressive Democratic platform. And what we agreed on that evening is to bring the two campaigns together. And the end result of that was that we wrote, and it ended up being passed in Orlando, Florida, we ended up writing the most progressive political platform in the history of the United States of America. And that was a platform, not just to my mind sitting, some paper sitting on a shelf someplace. That was a platform that became the embodiment of what a lot of men and women, a lot of candidates were running on in 2016, and as Maurice just indicated, certainly in 2018. It kind of was the platform that I think essentially reformed the political agenda of the Democratic Party. So that was one of the things that we talked about. How do we get people excited? How do we create a strong progressive political agenda? And to a large degree, in that process, we didn't get everything that we wanted, but we got a whole lot. Second issue that we talked about, equally important, was how you reform the Democratic Party. It is no secret that the Democratic Party essentially had given up, unbelievably, a national party had given up in about half the states in this country. How do you have a national party which is strong on the East Coast and in New England, strong on the West Coast, got a few states in between, but has abdicated some of the poorest states in the country to right-wing Republicans? So we talked about how you create a vibrant 50-state party, and then we talked about some structural issues within the Democratic Party. One of the things that was very upsetting, not only to me, but I think to many of you and to our supporters and to people all over the country, was the fundamental unfairness of the primary process. it is very hard for anybody to defend, and I think Hillary Clinton chose not to defend it. A situation where one candidate in 2016, in this case Secretary Clinton, started the campaign off with 500 superdelegates. All right? And, essentially what that meant is that before the first ballot was cast by the general public in Iowa in early 2017, she already had 500 superdelegates. And it is very hard to defend that, and she chose not to defend that, to her credit. And what happened is we put together a committee which met and argued and argued. But the end of it is, I think many of you know, is that a number of months ago, the Democratic National Committee voted to end superdelegate voting on the first ballot. And I think there are other reforms. We have many caucuses. And by the way, when we talk about reforms, I hope many of you know that right here in New York State, you have one of the most reactionary election processes in the entire country. All right, that if somebody wants to vote in the Democratic primary and say they are an independent or they want to switch parties, they have to do it something like 8 months before the primary. Okay, 13, sorry. I mean, it is clearly an incumbent protection policy, and I believe now with Democrats in New York State now controlling the House and the Senate, there's going to be some changes there. But please keep your eye on that issue. It is very important. We talk about voter suppression all over the country and Republican governors doing their best to make it hard for people of color or poor people to vote. Keep your eye on New York State and help change what goes on here as well. Anyhow, out of the meeting came, obviously, what Secretary Clinton was concerned about is the role that I would play in the campaign. And I was determined, and not everybody agreed with me, but I was determined to do everything that I could to defeat Donald Trump. And the result of that was that over a 3-month period, I traveled to 13 states, the battleground states. I held 39 rallies and events for Secretary Clinton and other Democratic candidates. I worked as hard as I could to make sure that we defeated Trump and that Clinton was elected president. And I remember, and I write about this in the book, the election was on November 8th, and I was on a plane coming back from, I think, Las Vegas. I was out in the Southwest campaigning. And we came back, and I was on the plane, and we were talking. And I was saying, based on the recent trip, I had been in Iowa, and I had a bad feeling. I had been all over Iowa during my campaign. I knew the state a little bit, but when I was there campaigning for Clinton, I just did not have a good feeling. And then we did a very good rally. Clinton and I did a very good rally in Raleigh, North Carolina. And it was a beautiful evening. There were 5,000 people out, a very diverse crowd. I felt good. But then I learned that just right at the same time, Trump had done a rally in North Carolina. We had a much, much larger crowd. So I was, very nervous about the election. And I remember coming back saying, I think Clinton is going to win. But I think, maybe it's a 3-to-1 shot that she'll win. But there is a possibility that Trump would win. And my wife, who, of course, as you know, is smarter than I, she thought that actually Trump would win. And then back home, what we usually do on election night, we have a few friends and family over, and we watch the returns. And it was a very, very difficult night, I know, for millions of people, you and me. And I watched the returns come in. And usually what we do in Burlington, Vermont, is, as the evening progresses, I would go downtown. The Democrats have an event, and I always go to it and say a few words and speak to the media and so forth. On that night, for the first time, I just couldn't leave the house. And I was really quite depressed and was asking myself what millions and millions of Americans were also asking, and that is, how could a man who was a pathological liar, who was a sexist, and we saw his attitude toward women unfold during the campaign, a racist, a xenophobe, a homophobe, and a religious bigot, how could this man be elected President of the United States. But it was clear to me, that it was not good enough to be depressed and upset about it. We had to sit down and figure out where we go from here, which is essentially what the title of the book is. And, we had to deal not only with the Trump presidency, there was some hope, and I worked very hard on this, raised a lot of money on this to elect a Democratic Senate. We failed in that as well. So we came back to Washington with Donald Trump as president, with right-wing Republicans running the House and the Senate. And that was very difficult. And it was clear to me, and I think to millions of other people, that our option was not simply to live in despair, but as Maurice indicated, it was imperative that we stood up and that we began the long, hard fight of taking on Trump and right-wing Republicanism. And essentially what the book is about, and I hope you'll enjoy it, it talks about the many efforts that I and progressives all over the country, I'm sure including many of you, participating, the efforts that we made over the last 2 years to oppose Trump's ugly right-wing politics and to work to create an economy and a government that represents all of us and not just the 1%. And clearly, as Maurice mentioned as well, the goal that we have is to do exactly the opposite of what Trump is trying to do every single day. He thinks it is to his political benefit to divide this country up based on the color of our skin, based on where we were born, based on our religion, based on our gender, based on our sexual orientation. Divide us up. And our approach is obviously exactly the opposite. It is bringing our people together to stand up and fight for a progressive agenda. And that agenda, of course, is based on the principles of economic, social, racial, and environmental justice. So that we had a hell of a big job in front of us, and I had to make a decision as to whether or not I wanted to become part of the Democratic leadership. And I was ambivalent about it because there are pluses and there are minuses, but I ended up deciding to do it because the position that I took was kind of outreach director for Democrats in the Senate. Because what I believed then and what I believe now is Democrats cannot continue to do what they had done for a long time, and that is run an inside the Beltway strategy. You had to take the fight to people all over the country and build up strong grassroots activism. And literally the first fight that we had, and we worked very, very hard on this, was, as you all will recall, Trump and the Republican leadership wanted to end the Affordable Care Act. And that meant, they had a number of proposals. That meant, the last proposal meant literally throwing 32 million Americans off of the health care that they have. Hard to believe that anyone could propose that. But that's what they proposed. And we traveled all over this country, and I remember like it was yesterday. In the beginning of this process, we went to Macomb County, Michigan. And that had been a county that Obama had won but swung to Trump. And it wasn't an accident that we went there. And we had a huge rally with about 8,000 people. It was a cold day. People were outside. And we began the process, along with grassroots organizations all over this country, of standing up and fighting back. And the end result is, all of you know, by one vote, it turned out to be the late Senator John McCain, we ended up defeating the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. We also worked very hard to end the disastrous so-called tax reform bill which, as you know, provided $1 trillion in tax breaks to the top 1%. 83% of the benefits over a 10-year period went to the top 1%. We worked really hard on that one. We could not get any Republican support in opposition. Now, early on, during the presidential campaign, Jane and I, in mid-June, invited a group of our strongest political supporters, many of our surrogates who had been with me throughout the entire campaign. We invited them to Burlington to ask a very simple question. Again, the question is the title of the book. Where do we go from here? And it was a really very good and long discussion. And what we understood as we began the discussion is that we together had waged a campaign which had taken on the entire Democratic establishment. We ran a campaign which we had one U.S. Senator supporting me. We had a handful of members in the House. We had no governors, no major city mayors. We ended up getting 5% of the superdelegates. Clinton got 95%. So we took on the entire Democratic establishment. We took on the corporate media. During the beginning of the campaign, we got virtually no coverage, which probably was better than the coverage we ended up getting. And with hundreds of daily newspapers around America, we ended up getting the endorsement of one newspaper. Thank you, Seattle Times. But despite all of that, because of your support, we ended up winning 22 states, over 13 million votes. And what was most important to me as we looked at the results is all of the exit polls showed that we ended up winning more votes from young people under 30 than Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton combined. And I think that word went out. It went out all over the country that the future of American politics is with us and our ideas. And in fact, a pollster at the Harvard Institute of Politics commented that our campaign not just moved the Democratic Party to the left, but it moved an entire generation to the left. And what is that about? What that is about is a very simple principle. The truth is that if you watch television, if you read the papers, if you listen to most politicians, some of the very most important issues, like who owns the country, about the nature of a corrupt campaign finance system, about the massive level of income and wealth inequality that exists in this country. Those issues and many more are virtually not discussed. And it turned out that when we were able to run a strong grassroots campaign in every state in this country, when you start talking about those issues, lo and behold, the American people start nodding their heads and say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense that we should not be the only major country in the world not to guarantee health care to all people. It makes a lot of sense that the minimum wage should not be a starvation minimum wage, but a living wage of at least $15 an hour. When you think about it, you know, it's not rocket science. You live in a competitive global economy. And if our kids are going to get the good jobs that are out there, and if our country is going to succeed economically, we need to have what we once had, but no longer have, the best educated workforce in the world. not a radical idea, which leads us to the obvious conclusion that free public education from K to 12 is not good enough. We've got to make public colleges and universities tuition free. And that we have to deal with the horrific level of student debt that so many people in this country are carrying. In any case, we sat down and we talked. And in my home, and we try to figure out where do we go from here. And one of the very logical options that was available to us is that we could do what virtually every losing presidential campaign does, and that is pack up our bags and go home. Nothing wrong with that, because the people in that room, they were leaders in the civil rights movement, there were labor leaders in the room, there were leaders in the women's movement in the room, leaders in the environmental movement, there were elected officials who were really working quite hard, doing the important work that they do. And I'm a United States Senator. I had my work cut out for me. But I think the conclusion that we reached is that the campaign had accomplished so much, had broken through in so many ways, that it would be a mistake to simply pack our bags and go home. So, and what we concluded is that what we had to continue working on were the two major tenets of what our campaign and the political revolution were about, two major tenets. Number one, the fight for a progressive agenda, the need for the American people to think big, not small, to look at what the wealthiest country in the history of the world could actually accomplish, all right? And in that regard, as I'll touch on in a minute, we have had an incredible amount of success, frankly, much more than I dreamed that we would have. You look at the polling out there. Last two major polls that I saw on health care, Medicare for all, single payer, is now supported by 70% of the American people. And I want you all to remember, 3 years ago, virtually nobody was talking about it. Oh, how can we approve the Affordable Care Act and so forth and so on? Nobody was talking about it. Now you got 70% of the American people. 3 years ago, Democrats in Congress were saying, we've got to raise that minimum wage. We've got to raise it to $10.60 an hour. Radical idea. Today, we have on the bill that I've introduced, for $15 an hour, we have 30 co-sponsors, and cities and towns all over America are passing $15 an hour minimum wage. And as a result of some great grassroots work done by employees at Disneyland in Anaheim and Orlando, Florida, result of good grassroots work done by employees of Amazon, we have got those two major corporations to raise their minimum wage to $15 an hour, etc. So we have had, and I think no one denies it, a significant impact in changing political discourse in America and moving it into a much more progressive way. The second area that we focused on is what we understood in that room, which is clearly true, is you're going to have all the great ideas in the world. We can all sit in a room and come up with great ideas about the kind of world we would like, but those ideas don't mean anything unless we create a strong grassroots 50-state political movement. And I have to tell you that in that regard, we have made success as well. Now, specifically out of that meeting in Burlington came two organizations. One was Our Revolution. And Our Revolution, you know, I know the media picks up and they say, well, Our Revolution supported this candidate and they lost. Our Revolution has done a phenomenal job in the last 2.5 years. It started under the leadership of Jeff Weaver, my former campaign manager. He did a great job. Nina Turner picked up about a year ago. And she has done a great job. And the goal of our revolution is nothing less than revitalizing American democracy. And our revolution now has over 600 chapters all across this country, in almost every state. And I will tell you about a meeting that was just so moving to me that I went to. It was in Washington, D.C. It was organized by Our Revolution and Progressive Change. They worked together on it. And they brought 450 people to Washington, D.C. who were potential candidates from Congress to City Council. And they did a series, I think the program went on for 3 or 4 days, and they taught all of these people who were new to politics. Almost all of them were first-time candidates. They taught them the fundamentals. How do you raise money? How do you do a press release? How do you perform well in a debate? How do you get volunteers to participate in your campaign? And the result of all of that work, not just that meeting, but so many others, is that what we have seen all over this country is at the grassroots level, first-time candidates, often women, often people of color, often young people, are now getting into the political process in a way that we have never seen. And the second, so out of that meeting came the idea to form Our Revolution. And the other idea that we had was the need to continue our educational efforts. And I want to make this point. As somebody who has been to virtually every state in this country, what many people don't appreciate is you go to states in the South, you go to states in the Plains, and the only media people get, they're watching, is Fox television, they're listening to right-wing talk radio. There is no progressive alternative out there for them to latch onto. And out of this meeting came what we call the Sanders Institute, which was started by my wife. And in fact, this weekend, she's putting on a great conference. Otherwise, she would be here, as I mentioned. And the goal there is to take progressive ideas, not in 12-second sound bites, but really to take those ideas, to have serious debate and discussion, put those ideas online, and to help raise political consciousness in this country, again, in every state in America. And they're succeeding in that very well. So, the results, I think, of the last couple of years, have been quite impressive. I think we have changed political debate in America in a very significant way. There is a record number of new members of Congress who are going to fight for Medicare for all, who are going to fight for a $15 an hour minimum wage, free tuition at public colleges and universities, and who understand what the President of the United States tragically does not understand, is that climate change is very, very real. And they also understand that we have a criminal justice system which is absolutely broken and in many ways racist, which needs to be reformed. And I'll just give you an example, just another example. I mean, and they have, Our Revolution has worked with candidates at every level of government, from city council on up to Congress. And in fact, supported Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And it helped her win, and helped other candidates who people did not think had a chance to win. But they also did something which doesn't get a lot of national attention. If you're concerned about criminal justice, what we have got to start doing is electing district attorneys and prosecutors who understand that their goal is not simply locking up people, but in fact reducing the prison population. And our revolution played a very important role in electing a fellow named Larry Krasner. Good. I'm glad people know about Larry, who is rewriting criminal justice in Pennsylvania. Our revolution understood, and this is very profound. You know, it's not going to change the world tomorrow. But our revolution played a very important role, and I work with them. They're an independent organization, legally, and in fact, they're independent of me. But we elected folks like in the South. We began the process of electing young, progressive African-American mayors. People like Randall Woodfin in Birmingham, Alabama. People like Chokwe Anton Lumumba in Jackson, Mississippi. You may not know it. You may not know it, but in the heart of the Confederacy in Jackson, Mississippi, rests an extremely progressive African-American mayor in the capital city of Mississippi. And all of us worked very hard on the brilliant campaigns that took place in Florida with Andrew Gillum running a brilliant campaign. And Stacey Abrams, Ben Jealous in Maryland ran a great campaign. So we lost, all right? But in the real world, you don't always win overnight. But do appreciate that as a result of the work of our revolution, grassroots activists, Andrew in Florida got over 49% of the vote, running on a progressive platform. And by the way, you may not know, but in Florida on the ballot, there was a ballot item that said that convicted felons who had served their time will get the right to vote. And that won. That won. And that means that well over 1 million people in Florida who were prevented from voting because they had committed a felony will be voting in the next election, and that is transformative in Florida. And our revolution, and I and many of you, have taken on Trump's xenophobia and his hatred of immigrants, and we have worked very hard with great candidates to fight for comprehensive immigration reform and a path towards citizenship. And we have also been very active working on what we call, what is obvious, common sense gun safety legislation, so we could stop the slaughters that go on in schools. So that is some of what we are doing. And in the book, I also talk about something else which is very, very important. Clearly, to change the country, we need to bring people together around a progressive agenda. Clearly, to change the country, we need to revitalize American democracy and not continue to have the lowest voter turnout of any major country on earth. And we should be very proud that in 2018, the election a couple of weeks ago, we had the largest voter turnout in the modern history of America. And voter turnout among young people actually soared. But having a progressive agenda, developing grassroots political activism is obvious. That's what we have to do. But we have to do much more than that. We have to deal with the realities of right-wing talk radio, with Fox television, with the Rush Limbaughs of the world, and so forth. And we have not gotten yet to anywhere near where we need to be. What I have been doing in my office is working very, very hard on social media, because I have believed from day one that it is very, very hard for us to talk about progressive ideas within the framework of the corporate media. It is very hard to go beyond the issue of the day. it is very hard to inject issues about income and wealth inequality to a media that really, for obvious reasons, is not particularly interested in hearing about that. It is hard to talk about the greed of the pharmaceutical industry when you see constant bombardment on TV of one ad after another from the drug companies. Hard to do. So what we have tried to do in our office, with some success, is develop our own social media. And this is the result of a lot of hard work by some great people, young people, in my office. And right now, we have over 7 million followers on our Senate Facebook. We have over 5 million on our campaign Facebook. We're not quite to where Trump is, but he lies a lot about his numbers. Ours are legitimate. We had 8 million people on Twitter. We have close to 3 million on Instagram. And what we do every single day, it's not like we come up with something once a day, every single day, we are going out to the American people, and by the way, not just people in the United States. It is called the internet. It's a global internet. Go out to people all over the world talking about what progressive politics is about. It's about workers' rights and workers' dignity. It's about ending discrimination in all its forms. It's about fighting sexism and racism and homophobia. But what we are trying to do is show that it's not just this or that what the progressive agenda is about is an agenda that speaks in every way to the needs of ordinary Americans and people throughout the world. So we've worked very hard on that. And what I'm very proud of, if I may ego trip here a little bit, is I remember talking to a guy on NBC. I was on a show and I said, he asked me about health care and I had my 6 seconds to respond. And I said, I can't explain Medicare for all in 6 seconds. Why don't you do, here is an issue that impacts everybody. It is the issue that most Americans are concerned about. Why don't you have here on NBC a town meeting talking about why we are the only major country not to guarantee health care at all, why we spend twice as much per capita, why we pay the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs, why our life expectancy is lower than many other countries. Why don't you have that meeting? Take an hour and a half, educate the American people. He said, Bernie, that's a great idea. I'm going to push it up the food chain here. I'll get back to you. Never got back to me. Still waiting. But instead of just waiting for NBC or CBS to do it, what we said, we're going to do it. We are going to do it. And what we did, I'm very proud of this, is we hooked up with progressive media outlets, Young Turks and others. And we did a Medicare for All town meeting in Washington. We filled up beautiful arena in the visitors, a beautiful auditorium in the visitors center. And then we live streamed it. And we had about 1.5 million people watching it. So it proved to me that people are prepared to sit down and actually think about wonky issues and hear from different people about one of the most important issues facing the country. And then we did another one on income and wealth inequality. No senator has ever done a town meeting on income and wealth inequality. And, all right. And you know what? We had even more people watching that one. And this is what blew me away. And this tells you the potential. This is not an end. This is a beginning. We had more people watching an 1.5 hour town meeting on income and wealth inequality than CNN did on that night. Now, we didn't have as many as Fox did. MSNBC beat us. But that is not insignificant. And it tells me that if we can produce good, meaningful television on the issues that the American people care about, you know what? People do want to learn about those issues. And actually, on Monday night, there's an issue out there which is another issue that by and large, corporate media, especially the television, has significantly downplayed. All of you are familiar with the report that came out last month from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. You're aware that 13 U.S. government agencies issued a report last week saying what everybody here knows to be true, that not only is climate change real, not only is it caused by human activity, it is already causing devastating problems. God, the horror of what we saw in California, at least 85 people died, billions of dollars in damage. Rising sea levels already impacting Alaska and Florida. The acidification of the ocean. Drought, floods, impacting migration of people all over the world, raising very serious national security issues. This is real, all right? What we are doing on Monday night is having a town meeting with some of the best environmentalists in this country on climate change. Please watch it. Monday night at 7 o'clock. As some of you know, there was an election a couple of weeks ago. You heard about that. And while the results were not as strong as we would like, let's not kid ourselves. And that is, Trump and his Republican friends took a real beating on November 6th. Let's not minimize that. It is no small thing, and I travel all over the country along with many other people, trying to make this happen, that Democrats now control the U.S. Congress. It is no small thing. Democrats flipped 7 governor's chairs all over this country. And while it doesn't get a lot of attention, it is extremely important that Democrats flipped hundreds of legislative seats in state legislatures all over the country, including New York State. Thank you, New York. And I think the American people are going to be very, very surprised when they see what this new freshman class in the Congress is going to be about. The election has come and gone, and we did reasonably well. Where do we go from here? Well, I think 2 things. Clearly, that with Democrats controlling the House, what is terribly, terribly, terribly important is Democrats produce a bold agenda with a sense of urgency. The American people, I think, want action. They don't want this stuff going on, talk and talk and talk. They want to move. I was in the Congress in 1994, and some of you may remember. That was when Newt Gingrich came in with his contract in America. Now, I opposed everything in it. But what Gingrich did, Gingrich came in and he had a bold agenda and he moved it. We were working, 16 hours a day because he was pushing this stuff through. There's a lesson to be learned, and that is there's a lot of pain in this country right now. There are a lot of unfilled needs. We went through 2 years under Republican rule where virtually none of the most important issues facing our people was even discussed, let alone dealt with. So we have got to work in the Senate and the House with a sense of urgency and bring forth important legislation that speaks to the needs of working people. And now Republicans are going to be in the position which they have not been over the last 2 years. It's one thing not to do anything, but it is another thing to have to say no when legislation comes across their desk calling for health care for all, calling for raising the minimum wage, calling for transforming our energy system. And I have the feeling that some of them are not going to be all that happy. But our job is to move forward with a sense of urgency. Now, what does that mean? It means that clearly after 2 years of not having any serious congressional oversight, President Trump is going to wake up soon and find out that there is a body of the United States Congress who is going to start holding him accountable for what he does. That's pretty big. President Trump will not impede the Mueller investigation. That ain't going to happen. There are people who are going to be taking a very hard look at what we call the emoluments clause. And that is to ask a simple question. And again, you would not think that we would have to ask this question. You know, we had conservative presidents in the past. But to what degree are Trump's financial investments impacting his governmental decisions? Is he palsy-walsy with Vladimir Putin just because he likes authoritarianism? Maybe. Or is there a financial reason as well? And the same thing is with our leader of Saudi Arabia and what Trump's financial involvements are there as well. And by the way, if I may divert for a moment, we believe that this week, maybe on Wednesday, I and Senator Mike Lee, who's a conservative Republican from Utah, that we are going to have what we call a privileged resolution on the floor of the Senate to end U.S. involvement in the Saudi-led war in Yemen. And I know that Trump, as we speak, Trump and the Republican leadership are doing everything they can to defeat our resolution. I think we have the votes to win it. And I want you all to know that what's going on, the media doesn't talk about it too much, but what's going on in Yemen, which is, to start with, a very poor country, is one of the great humanitarian disasters in modern history. And we're talking about 85,000 children over the last several years who have already starved to death. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of them who are hungry today and facing starvation. We're talking about the possibility of mass famine. We're talking about the worst cholera epidemic that we have seen in many, many years. So our job is not to support the very, very dangerous and misguided military adventurism of Saudi Arabia, but to end the war and to get humanitarian aid to a country that desperately needs it. I think you're going to see investigations also into the disastrous Trump administration response to the tragedy in Puerto Rico, to the hurricane there. Thousands of people died there, and it is incomprehensible as to how slow the rebuilding effort has been. I think you're going to see some serious investigation about the use of the United States military on the southern border of this country for political purposes. And among many, many other issues that some of my colleagues are all working on. And the other thing I think we need to do is to reach out to our brothers and sisters in conservative states. The point that I make in the book, and I really believe this, having been all over this country, is I do not believe, and I hope you do not believe, in blue states and red states. What we should understand is that any state in this country where people are struggling, and people are struggling the most in many of the red states, like West Virginia, where people are struggling, they are our allies, and we've got to stand with them. And I think that as part of that process, what we need to do is expose Trump as the pathological liar that he is. And I don't mean, really is, we take it for granted that, stop for a moment. We take it for granted, but think how embarrassing and awful it is that we have a president of the United States who nobody believes. It doesn't matter what he says, because odds are that it is a lie. And if it's not a lie, he'll probably change his mind tomorrow. All right? And we got to expose that. When Trump went and spoke to the American people during the campaign, he talked about health care for all. It was a lie. He tried to cut 32 million people off of health care. He talked about protecting Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. His budget called for massive cuts to Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. He talked about a tax bill that would not provide benefits to the wealthy. 83% of the benefits go to the top 1%. A lot of people don't know that. And we've got to get that word out. But I think most importantly, what we have got to do is bring the people of this country together around an agenda that they already support. What Trump, we just went through a campaign. We just went through a campaign where hundreds of millions of dollars were spent on 30-second ads. Not one of those ads said, vote for Republican candidate X because he's going to give tax breaks to billionaires and cut your Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. But that is exactly what they do. All right? Meanwhile, poll after poll suggests that people support our agenda. Health care for all, raising the minimum wage, pay equity for women, rebuilding our crumbling infrastructure, immigration reform, criminal justice reform, making public colleges and universities tuition-free, climate change, transforming our nature. These are not my ideas. They're not your ideas. These are ideas, and I want to emphasize this point. These are the ideas that the American people in poll after poll after poll support. Gun safety legislation, overwhelmingly supported by gun owners and non-gun owners. So that is our task, to go out to the conservative states, to have the guts to take on a handful of billionaires in this country who have enormous economic and political power, and to stand up and fight for an agenda that will create a good life. And we can do this. We're not a poor country. A good life for every man, woman, and child in America. That is our task, and that is the work that we have got to do right now. Thank you all very much.
Let's give it up for Bernie.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, I think we have a couple of questions, Maurice.
Yeah, we've collected a few questions from the audience earlier, and just a heads up, Bernie has to catch a train, so got to make sure he gets out on time. So the first question, sort of deals with a theme that you discussed during your talk. How exactly do we push back against the false narrative that progressives can't win, especially with all of the electoral and policy victories that we've seen, but that's not really reflected in the media?
Look, the media wrote the story before the election. Do you think that the Washington Post is going to say, my God, this country is moving in a progressive agenda? We got great progressives winning all over the country, and that's the future of America? That is not what the establishment media will ever write. Okay? I take it as a badge of honor that during my campaign, in a one-day period, there were 16 negative articles against me in the Washington Post. It's an all-time world's record. But here is the fact, and here is the truth, that on all of these issues that we've talked about, the economic issues, the environmental issues, the criminal justice issues, the immigration reform issues. Did you know that 80% of the American people support legal status for the 1.8 million young people in the DACA program? 80%, not even close. Almost half of Republicans support Medicare for all. So what we have got to do is continue the work. And a lot of work has to be done to educate our friends, especially in the conservative states where all they're seeing is Fox television, to tell them that the most important issue facing America is not getting rid of transgender people in the military.
Great. Now, here's a question that touches on our foreign policy, just pretty straightforward. What steps towards peace should the U.S. be making in this particular moment?
It is sad, and again, that we have, one of the reasons there was a fairly good appropriations bill that we fought for. Elizabeth Warren and I worked hard to make sure that child care was significantly funded, the Social Security and so forth. I voted against it, and I voted against it because it significantly increased military spending. And we now spend more than the next 10 countries in the world combined on the military. So I think, look, this week I'm focusing on ending this terrible war in Yemen, but I think what we need to do is to say to the world, unlike Trump, that we do not believe in authoritarianism. We believe in human rights and democracy. And that we are going to have leadership in this country which speaks for human rights and democracy. In the Middle East, I think the United States finally is going to have to play a level-handed, have a level approach toward the Middle East that cannot simply be pro-Saudi Arabia and pro-Israel. We need to have an even-handed approach. We need to bring, I worry very, very much. One of the tinderboxes in the world is the Middle East, that the United States is going to get sucked into a never-ending war between Sunnis and Shias, between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And we need to tell this part of the world that they're going to have to come together. We're not going to spend billions of dollars more. We're not going to see our young men and women get killed. We have to stand together, bring them together to work out a painful road to peace. They may not like it, but that's what we've got to do, I think.
We're going to go back to domestic issues and take a question, a two-part question. So, first part, many European countries offer apprenticeship programs as an alternative to going to college. And what are your thoughts on doing something similar in the U.S.? Second question, what are the ways that we can improve America's infrastructure?
Good. In terms of the first question, a very important question. Look, the truth is, not every person in this country wants to go to college. Not every person in this country is academically inclined. But many of those people do not now have the training they need to get the good jobs that are out there. They don't have the technical skills that they need. So when I talk about higher education, it's not just college. It's making sure we train people to be welders and carpenters, to do the various crafts work. There are good paying jobs all over this country. And people need the training to do that. Last year in Burlington, we had the ambassador from Germany. And Germany has probably the best apprenticeship program in the world. And in fact, many of their kids don't go to university, but they get this apprenticeship training. They are paid to go to school. They are paid to do the job. And it is a very successful program of which I think we have a lot to learn. And that ties into the second part of this question. And that, as all of you know, we have an infrastructure, and it's not just roads and bridges. It is affordable housing, which needs to be built. And if you think that Flint, Michigan is the only city in America with water problems, you're seriously mistaken. So we need to improve our water systems, our wastewater plants, our airports, our rail system. And all of this ties together, by the way, with the fight against climate change. Because if we can electrify our transportation system, we're going to take a big bite out of carbon getting into the atmosphere. And all of that stuff will create millions and millions of good-paying jobs, and we need to make sure that our young people are trained to do those jobs.
Great. Thanks, Bernie. This is the last question. This is your final question, Bernie, and this is a personal question. Who was your greatest role model when you were a budding activist?
When I was young, now I'm an older activist. I would say in my life, people who inspired me the most, I am old enough to have attended the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Justice. And over the years, I studied King, Dr. King. And the more I studied, the more I was impressed by him. He was a complicated guy, but he was not only a brilliant theoretician, but he was an extraordinary organizer. And he was a man of great courage. And the courage was not just his willingness to lead a march with people, threatening to kill him. That's pretty courageous. But he did something, Maurice, I know you know, and many people here know. He was a great civil rights leader, and he won the Nobel Peace Prize, He had all these laurels that he could sit on. But what his conscience dictated is that he speak out against the war in Vietnam. And when he took on the president who signed the Civil Rights Act, did the right thing, and he took on Johnson, suddenly all of the liberal media that had said what a great civil rights leader he was no longer thought he was such a great leader. What the hell was he doing talking about Vietnam? Supposed to worry about Mississippi. And a lot of his funding was cut off from liberal circles. So if you look at the totality of his life and his courage, it is very inspiring. And there's another person who was before King, who was a very great American. And I ended up doing a video on him years and years ago. And that was Eugene V. Debs. A man who I dare say 98% of the American people never heard of. Also a man of extraordinary courage. Ended up going to jail in opposition to World War I. Ran for president from a jail cell. And many of the ideas that he talked about in his 6 campaigns for president ended up in one form or another being adopted by FDR in the New Deal. So those are 2 people that come to mind who are both, I think, courageous visionaries and extraordinary effective organizers.
Thank you, Bernie. Give it up for Senator Bernie Sanders.
Thank you all.
Sometimes